everyone knows the story of the Spanish Armada in 1588, right? But what if I told you the fuse for that whole massive invasion was actually lit 3 years earlier, with a secret deal signed at an English palace that had a really strange name? Well, that's what we're talking about today. The Treaty of Nonsuch. It's the agreement that put England and Spain on an absolute collision course. So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did one treaty, signed at a place called Nonsuch, provoke a global superpower into launching one of the most famous invasion fleets in all of history? As we're about to see, pretty much every single part of this deal was another step pushing England and Spain closer and closer to war. So let's dive in and unpack how it all went down. Okay, to really get this treaty, we've got to rewind a bit and head over to the Netherlands. For years, the Dutch had been fighting this brutal, long, drawn-out revolt against their rulers, the Spanish Empire. Now, Spain was not messing around. They were determined to crush this rebellion, and the ways they were doing it were getting more and more extreme. And things really hit a boiling point in 1576. You had all these Spanish soldiers who hadn't been paid, so they mutinied and just went on an absolute rampage in the city of Antwerp. This event became known as the Spanish Fury, and it was a horrifying massacre. Thousands of civilians were killed. The sheer brutality of it sent shockwaves across Europe, and it completely changed how England was looking at this whole conflict. The Spanish Fury wasn't just some battle. It became this incredibly powerful piece of propaganda. It fed into something that people were already calling the Black Legend, this whole narrative that painted the Spanish as uniquely evil and cruel. For Protestant England, this wasn't some far-off problem anymore. It felt like proof of a tyrannical Catholic power that was becoming a genuine existential threat. So you can imagine all of this is putting immense pressure on Queen Elizabeth I, and she's in a ridiculously tough spot. If she intervenes in the Netherlands, she's openly challenging the most powerful empire in the world. But if she does nothing, well, that had its own set of huge dangers. This was a super high-stakes calculation with no easy answer. In the end, it really came down to 4 key things that basically forced her hand. We can use the acronym MEGA to remember them. First, M for massacres. The whole Black Legend thing made the Spanish threat feel real and immediate. Then E for exploration. Remember, Sir Francis Drake had been raiding Spanish ships for years, which had already made King Philip furious. G is for geography, and this one was huge. If Spain took full control of the Netherlands, it would be the perfect launch pad, a springboard for an invasion of England. And finally, A for assassination. In 1584, the Dutch rebel leader William the Silent was murdered, and that left a massive power vacuum. Elizabeth knew that if she didn't step in, the whole rebellion could just fall apart. So, with all that pressure building, something had to give, and it did, in August of 1585 at Nonsuch Palace. This is where English and Dutch representatives secretly hammered out a formal deal. And this wasn't just some vague promise of support, no. This was a binding military alliance. It was a direct challenge to Spain. This was the Treaty of Nonsuch. So what did England actually promise? Well, first up, troops. A lot of them. Elizabeth pledged to send 6,400 foot soldiers to go fight on the front lines, right alongside the Dutch rebels. And it wasn't just foot soldiers. To back them up, she also promised 1,000 cavalry, which was a pretty big deal. And to lead this entire army, she appointed her very close friend and confidant, Robert Dudley. So this was no small gesture. This was a real boots-on-the-ground military intervention. But, armies need money, so on top of the soldiers, Elizabeth promised a huge annual subsidy of 600,000 florins. Now, that's a ton of money for sure, but it's important to remember it only covered about a quarter of the total cost of the revolt. So England was investing heavily, but they weren't about to bankroll the entire war. And this just shows you how businesslike this whole deal really was. In exchange for all that manpower and money, England demanded some insurance. The Dutch had to hand over 2 really important strategic ports, Brill and Flushing, as collateral. England would then garrison these so-called cautionary towns at its own expense. It was a way to make sure they had a secure foothold on the continent, no matter what happened. But here is where a critical and honestly a pretty disastrous misunderstanding came into play. The Dutch rebels, they didn't just want an ally. They offered Elizabeth the title of Governor General, basically asking her to become their new queen. And she said no, absolutely not. You have to remember, her own claim to the throne was always being challenged, so the idea of just taking another nation's crown, it was way too risky. She wanted to be a protector, not an occupier. And that one decision, it would end up undermining the entire alliance. And that brings us to the fallout, because this treaty, which was supposed to be England's shield, almost immediately started to blow up in their faces. The short-term mission was a total failure, and the long-term diplomatic consequences, they were a catastrophe. So Robert Dudley's military campaign was pretty much doomed from the start. And it all goes back to that title Elizabeth turned down. The Dutch were expecting a queen who would lead them to total victory. What they got was a kind of reluctant ally who was only offering limited support. That's fundamental misunderstanding just created tons of mistrust and basically set the English intervention up to fail. Meanwhile, back in Spain, King Philip II was absolutely furious. He didn't see this as England helping out some rebels. No, he saw it as a rival monarch, Elizabeth, directly interfering in his territory and waging a proxy war against him. For Philip, the Treaty of Nonsuch was a personal insult. It was an act of war, period. And this timeline here, it just shows you how fast the dominoes fell. 1585, the treaty is signed. By 1587, Dudley's mission has failed so badly that Elizabeth has to pull back. So what does Philip II do? He sees that the English are tied up and failing in the Netherlands, and he pivots his entire military strategy. He can now focus all of his resources on one goal, invading England itself. And in 1588, that's exactly what he does. He launches the Spanish Armada. So this leaves us with a really interesting question. Was the Treaty of Nonsuch a terrible strategic blunder that just needlessly poked the bear and provoked the Spanish Empire? Or was it actually an accidental stroke of genius? I mean, think about it. While it failed miserably in the Netherlands, the whole mess bought England 3 critical years to get its defenses ready and prepare its navy for the invasion that was now definitely coming. A total failure that might have led directly to a legendary victory. What do you think?